Okay, so let's just imagine for a second that society as we know it vanishes. Poof, gone. No more rule of law. Resources are scarce. It's every person for themselves. What would you do? Would you just completely abandon all of your morals? Would you become this ruthless survivor? Or would you, try to hold on to those values that we consider civilized? It's a pretty chilling thought experiment, but it really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. Veneer theory.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. This idea that our, civilized behavior is just this really thin layer covering our true savage nature. It's something that's been debated for centuries. And today we're going to dive deep into this debate. We're going to explore the arguments for and against it. And we're going to ask, what it really means for how we understand ourselves and the world that we live in.
Yeah, I think this will be a really fun one. We've got some fascinating sources to guide us on this deep dive. We've got some classic philosophical texts, some modern research, even some accounts of how people behaved during Hurricane Katrina. And, if you're in that 45 to 60 age range like me, you've seen the world change a lot. So this deep dive might just make you question some of the assumptions that you've built up about human nature over the years. And hey, if you're loving this kind of deep thinking, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can join us each week as we unpack these complex ideas.
To kick things off, I think we should go back to one of the foundational thinkers who really shaped this discussion. Thomas Hobbes. His book Leviathan, published all the way back in 1651, paints a pretty grim picture of what life would be like without rules and without government.
Yeah, Leviathan. Isn't that where he famously declares that life without a strong ruler would be? Nasty, brutish, and short. I remember reading that in college and thinking, wow, this guy was seriously pessimistic.
Yeah, he was indeed. Hobbes believed that humans are fundamentally driven by self-interest, this constant desire for power and a fear of death, without a strong sovereign. To kind of keep our selfish instincts in check, we descend into chaos and violence, a war of all against all.
So he's basically saying that any sense of community or cooperation is only there because we're forced into it by the threat of punishment. I don't know, that doesn't sound very uplifting.
It's not a very rosy view of human nature, that's for sure. But what's interesting is how much his ideas actually influenced the way societies thought about governing themselves.
How so? Give me an example.
We'll take the Federalist Papers, for instance. These essays were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay to advocate for the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. And they're really steeped in Hobbesian thinking.
Okay, yeah, the Federalist Papers. Those were big on checks and balances, right? Making sure that no one branch of government got too powerful.
Exactly. And that concern with limiting power, with creating a system that would prevent any one person or group from becoming tyrannical, comes straight from Hobbes. The Federalists believed, like Hobbes, that human nature needed to be constrained by a carefully designed system of government.
So even in a democracy, the assumption was that people couldn't really be trusted to always act in the best interest of everyone.
That's a key takeaway here. The framers of the Constitution, at least some of them, were operating under a very Hobbesian view of human nature, and they built a system to try to safeguard against those darker impulses they believe were inherent to us all.
Interesting. But I'm guessing not everyone agreed with Hobbes. This whole humans are inherently selfish idea.
You're right. There were other voices in the conversation, offering a very different perspective on human nature. One of the most prominent critics of Hobbes was Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Oh yeah, Rousseau. He was all about the noble savage right. Believed that civilization was the thing corrupting us, not the other way around.
That's a good way to summarize it. Rousseau argued that humans are naturally good, compassionate, and cooperative, but that the structures of society, particularly private property and inequality, distort our true nature and lead to competition and conflict.
So according to Rousseau,
Yeah.
it's not our inherent savagery that we need to worry about. It's the way society itself can warp us.
Precisely. He believed that if we could strip away the artificial constraints of civilization and return to a more natural state, we'd find that humans are capable of living together in harmony and peace.
Wow, that's quite a contrast to Hobbes. So we've got these two radically different visions of human nature. One, inherently selfish and violent. The other, inherently good and cooperative. I imagine this debate is still raging on today.
Absolutely. That fundamental tension between those two perspectives continues to shape our political discourse, our social policies, and even our personal beliefs about the world. It's really the heart of many of the arguments we have about the role of government, the importance of individual freedom, and the potential for social change.
It's fascinating to think about how these philosophical ideas from centuries ago are still so relevant today. But it's one thing to debate human nature in the abstract, It's another to see how it plays out in the real world.
Exactly. So if veneer theory is right, if civilization really is just this fragile facade, barely containing our primal urges, then shouldn't we see that veneer crack? In certain situations, like in times of crisis or chaos, when the normal rules of society break down.
You're thinking about things like wars, natural disasters, riots, those moments when it feels like all bets are off.
Precisely. And one event that's often cited as evidence for veneer theory is Hurricane Katrina. The images of looting, violence, and social breakdown that emerged from New Orleans after the storm seem to confirm the worst fears about human nature.
Yeah, I remember those news reports vividly. It felt like we were watching civilization just crumble before our eyes. It was terrifying. But I do have to wonder, were those reports really an accurate reflection of what was happening on the ground?
That's a great question. And it's one that Rebecca Solnit tackles head on. In her book, A Paradise Built in Hell, Solnit has extensively studied how people behave in disaster situations and argues that the media's portrayal of Katrina was deeply flawed and ultimately misleading.
So she's saying that this whole descent into chaos narrative was exaggerated or even flat out wrong.
That's her argument. Solnit's research revealed a very different story, one of widespread altruism, cooperation, and community resilience. In the face of unimaginable hardship, she found countless examples of people helping each other, sharing resources, and forming bonds of solidarity amidst the devastation. And what's fascinating is Solnit argues that this disaster myth, this idea that chaos and violence are inevitable when disaster strikes, actually serves the interests of those in power.
That's a curious thought. How so?
Well, she suggests that elites often panic during disasters, and they kind of project their own fears about human nature onto those most affected. And then they use this veneer theory mindset to justify increased control and surveillance, which often hinders grassroots relief efforts that are already underway.
So instead of seeing the incredible resourcefulness and community support that often emerges in these situations, they just assume the worst and react accordingly.
Exactly. And that reaction, based on a flawed understanding of human nature, can actually do more harm than good. It reinforces this idea that people can't be trusted to help each other, which undermines the very spirit of cooperation that's so essential for recovery.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if sometimes the veneer of civilization we're supposedly upholding is actually more brittle and less effective than those spontaneous acts of human kindness that emerge when the chips are down.
That's a powerful insight. And it brings us to another case study that often gets held up as proof of veneer theory. The Stanford prison experiment. You're probably familiar with it. The infamous experiment where college students were randomly assigned roles as guards or prisoners in a simulated prison environment.
Oh yeah, that one's been in the news a lot. Didn't the guards start abusing the prisoners? Supposedly proving how easily ordinary people can turn into sadists?
That's the popular narrative, and it's certainly a chilling story. But the Stanford prison experiment, while impactful, has been heavily criticized and even debunked by researchers in recent years.
Wait, really? What's wrong with it?
Well, a sociologist named Thibault Letexier went back and reviewed the original research materials, and he found evidence that the experimenters, particularly Philip Zimbardo, who led the study, were actually coaching the participants to behave in more extreme ways.
So it wasn't just a neutral observation of human behavior. The researchers were actually manipulating the situation to get the results they wanted.
That's what the evidence suggests. For instance, the students playing the guards were initially hesitant to be harsh. It was the researchers who pushed them to take on a more authoritarian role, appealing to their sense of responsibility to the experiment.
So those images of the guards becoming abusive were less about some innate human tendency towards cruelty and more about responding to cues from the people in charge.
That's a more accurate interpretation, and that raises serious questions about the scientific validity of the entire experiment.
Ooh.
Instead of a genuine exploration of human nature, it becomes a cautionary tale about how easily research can be influenced by the biases and expectations of the researchers themselves.
Okay, so if we're questioning these classic examples used to support veneer theory, Hobbes, the misrepresentation of Katrina, the flawed Stanford prison experiment, where does that leave us? Is there a different way to understand human nature? One that's not so focused on our supposed dark side?
There is, and it's a perspective that's gaining more and more traction. As researchers delve deeper into the complexities of human behavior, one of the leading voices in this movement is Rutger Bregman, author of Humankind, A Hopeful History.
Okay, Humankind, a hopeful history. I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this hopeful history. What's his argument?
Bregman argues that for centuries we've been telling ourselves the wrong story about human nature. We focused on the exceptions, the wars, the atrocities, the moments when people behave badly, and we've used those to define who we are as a species.
So he's saying we've basically cherry-picked the evidence to support a negative view of humanity.
That's a key part of his argument. Bregman points out that there's actually a wealth of evidence from anthropology,
Yeah.
archaeology, and even evolutionary biology that suggests humans are fundamentally wired for cooperation and kindness.
So it's not just wishful thinking. There's actual science backing up a more optimistic view.
Exactly. And he goes beyond just pointing out the flaws in Veneer theory. He dives into the research that shows how altruism and compassion are deeply ingrained in our nature.
That's fascinating. Give me an example of the research he cites.
Well, he talks about studies of how people behave in real-life disasters, not just the sensationalized accounts we often see in the media. In these situations, time and again, researchers have observed extraordinary acts of selflessness, strangers risking their lives to help each other, communities coming together to support those in need.
So it's like what Rebecca Solnit found with Katrina, but on a larger scale. The reality of human behavior in these moments of crisis often contradicts the narratives we've been told.
Precisely. Bregman uses these real-world examples to illustrate the point that our capacity for empathy and cooperation is not some flimsy veneer. It's a fundamental part of who we are as a species. And perhaps, as he argues, it's the belief in that fundamental goodness that's the key to creating a better world.
That's a powerful idea.
Yeah.
But how do we bridge the gap between this hopeful vision and the reality of a world that often feels so divided and conflict-ridden? If we're wired for cooperation, why do we see so much of the opposite?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one we'll continue to explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll delve into the practical implications of embracing a more hopeful view of humanity, and consider how this shift in perspective could transform everything, from our personal relationships to the way we address global challenges.
So we spent this whole deep dive questioning this whole idea, that civilization is just a thin veneer covering up our true selfish nature. We looked at the classic arguments, the flawed evidence, and the compelling counterpoints. But where do we go from here? How do we actually live in a way that embraces this more hopeful view of humanity?
Yeah, that's the challenge, isn't it? It's one thing to talk about cooperation and altruism, but how do we actually cultivate those qualities in ourselves and in the world around us? Especially when it feels like so many of our systems reward selfishness and competition.
Right, it can feel like we're constantly bombarded with messages that reinforce fear and distrust. Turn on the news, scroll through social media, and it's easy to start believing that everyone's out for themselves.
Yeah, that's true. We are exposed to a lot of negativity, but research actually suggests that our beliefs about human nature actually influence how we behave. If we constantly expect the worst from each other, we're more likely to act in ways that confirm those expectations.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe people are inherently selfish, you're less likely to trust them, to offer help, to go out of your way to be kind.
Exactly. So the first step is to become aware of those negative assumptions and to start actively looking for evidence that contradicts them. Pay attention to those everyday acts of kindness, the small gestures of generosity, the ways people cooperate and support each other, even in like the most mundane situations.
I like that. It's like a mental exercise, retraining our brains to focus on the good
Yeah,
instead of getting caught up in the bad.
right. And the more we see those positive examples, the more our beliefs start to shift. It creates this positive feedback loop. We start to expect better from each other. And that can lead to a more trusting and cooperative environment overall.
It's like building a culture of kindness, one interaction at a time. And that can have a ripple effect, spreading outwards from our personal relationships to our communities and beyond.
Absolutely. And this brings us to another important point: the role of systems and institutions in shaping human behavior. If we want to create a world where cooperation and compassion flourish, we need to design systems that support those values.
So it's not just about changing individual mindsets. It's about changing the structures that influence how we interact with each other on a larger scale.
Precisely. Think back to the Stanford prison experiment. It wasn't just the individuals involved who contributed to that abusive behavior. It was the structure of the experiment itself, the power dynamics that were created, the roles that were assigned. Even people with good intentions can behave badly if they're placed in a system that encourages or rewards negative behavior.
That's a sobering thought. It means that even if we manage to shift our own beliefs about human nature, we still need to be mindful of the systems we're operating within.
Yeah, and if those systems aren't aligned with our values, then we need to work to change them. This could include everything from advocating for criminal justice reform to pushing for more collaborative and humane work environments. It's about creating spaces where people feel safe, supported, and empowered to act with kindness and generosity.
So instead of asking, how do we prevent people from being bad, we start asking, how do we help people be good? How do we create structures that nurture the best aspects of human nature?
That's the key question. Imagine a world where our institutions are designed to cultivate empathy, cooperation, and a sense of shared responsibility. A world where we celebrate acts of kindness, where we invest in social and emotional learning, where we prioritize well-being over profit. It's a challenging vision, but it's one worth striving for.
It certainly is. This whole conversation has been a real eye-opener for me, I think, for a long time. I've been operating under a pretty cynical view of human nature, focusing on the negative and assuming the worst. But after this deep dive, I'm feeling a renewed sense of hope. Maybe it's not naive to believe in the goodness of humanity. Maybe it's actually the key to unlocking a better future.
And that's what I hope our listeners take away from this episode. The belief in veneer theory, this idea that we're all just barely holding back our inner demons, has led us down a path of fear, distrust, and division. But there's another path we can choose, one that embraces the possibility of a more cooperative, compassionate, and just world. It starts with questioning our assumptions, challenging the narratives we've been told, and daring to believe in the best of who we are.
Well said. This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. And for those of you listening, I encourage you to continue exploring these ideas. Check out the sources we've discussed. Have conversations with your friends and family. And most importantly, pay attention to the ways that people are already living out this more hopeful vision of humanity in their everyday lives. It's all around us if we just open our eyes to see it.